As I've discussed, when I was a young lad, I was basically a full-time Nintendo kid. Primarily Super Nintendo and Nintendo 64 throughout the 90s. I got a PlayStation 2 for Christmas relatively early in that system's lifespan, but in between, I had a short stint with the original PlayStation, where I tried to catch up on all the big games I had missed for this system I'd never had. This included renting a copy of Tomb Raider 2 from Hollywood Video, and I was excited to finally get a chance to interact with a series I had experienced exclusively from reading GamePro and EGM as a kid in the mid-90s. I sat down and queued it up, and found myself completely unable to navigate past the very first screen. Tried and failed, and tried and failed, and just never managed to get past it, and thought, wow, this shit sucks, and just gave up and moved on to something else. I had not played a single other Tomb Raider game since. The original idea for Tomb Raider came from Toby Gard, an employee for British studio Core Design. Like seemingly every game studio in England in the early 90s, most of what Core Design did was make a bunch of moribund Commodore Amiga games that nobody remembers. They were brainstorming ideas for the upcoming PlayStation console, and Gard's original concept was basically just Indiana Jones. He was told to change it for legal reasons, and one point he came up with was featuring a female character, which he named Lara Croft. She eventually became Lara Croft, and the team said their inspirations included Indiana Jones, because duh, John Woo's Hard Boiled, because she holds two guns, and Tank Girl, because she, wears cargo shorts? The team's idea for the game was a cinematic, third-person 3D action game in a large, open space, which felt novel at the time. Gard said they wanted a, quote, caricatured personification of a woman who could be an action icon. And so, they gave her the traditional impossible waist and large breasts. Or at least, the best an original PS1 game could render large breasts in a polygonal format. This decision inspired an enormous media blitz in preparation for the game's release, with an inordinate amount of focus going to the fact that the protagonist of the game was a visual representation of a hot chick, you guys! They hired model and actress Rona Mitra to portray Lara Croft at industry events, and so much of the marketing was focused on gawking at representations of Croft's physical appearance. This was an era where the internet was beginning to establish ubiquity, and one of the early video game rumors of the internet age was that there was a way that you could see Lara Croft naked, as well as drawings and portrayals of such, including a fan-made software patch called Nude Raider. Gamers have always been a very cool lot. The game was very acclaimed upon original release, but as I discussed in the Virtua Striker 2 episode, there was so much technical innovation going on in this era, especially graphically, that sometimes games seemed like they would get general praise specifically because they were a new, novel visual experience, whether or not they'd hold up structurally. The game's publisher, Eidos Interactive, put enormous pressure on Core Design to pump out a second Tomb Raider as soon as possible, and most of the reports at the time was that the crunch was brutal, ruinous to their health and lives. This included original creator Toby Gard leaving the company to work on other projects. Tomb Raider 2 was pumped out so quickly that its release date was barely 1 calendar year after the original game. Tomb Raider 2 was mostly praised as well, but it did get dinged by critics, both for being very similar to the original game, albeit with more focus on person-to-person gunplay combat, and also for being ridiculously hard, even in the context of the first game also being ridiculously hard, saying that it could be alienating for players who didn't fully master Part 1. It was also mentioned that the graphics had generally suffered a distinct downgrade, with one specific exception. The team knew where their bread was buttered, and devoted huge polygonal power to Lara's appearance. And the media blitz was even stronger. The sexist obsession with Lara's body was so strong that the game even has a teasing shower scene ending and a fake cheat code that supposedly takes off her clothes, but actually makes you explode. 364 days later, a third game was pumped out at the same breakneck pace. Tomb Raider 3 focused more on the puzzle solving of the original than the gunplay of Part 2, but they realized that they didn't have enough time to build a new next-gen engine, and had to just work with the same aging franchise structure. The marketing focus was, once again, look at how hot this lady is! Reviewers said it definitely looked better than the previous games, but still looked dated as hell compared to fresh, new releases. TR3 was also criticized for being ruthlessly difficult and deeply frustrating to play, with one reviewer even accusing it of being a marketing scheme to sell strategy guides. I obtained the first 3 Tomb Raider games in anticipation of this week's subject, and I found the controls on each so stunningly broken that I gave each game 40 full minutes of verifiable gameplay, and was unable in any of the 3 attempts to get out of the first stage of each game. I don't know if that validated my 12-year-old experience, but it definitely mirrored it. And I found it a remarkably frustrating and negative experience. My notes are full of "F*** Lara Croft, f*** Tomb Raider." An entity that felt the same way about her as I did was her creators at Core Digital. The 4th Tomb Raider game was being developed in tandem with Tomb Raider 3, leading to reported physical and mental health issues among the staff, and narrative and creative fatigue. Writer Andrew Sandom said he took the lead on the story specifically because, quote, no one else wanted to be involved. The team had a clandestine meeting away from their bosses where they decided they were going to secretly kill off Lara at the end of Tomb Raider 4. Sandom's original ending had Lara being decapitated. Core's CEO, who had been left in the dark, put the kibosh on that, but they reported that just being able to discuss it allowed them to unburden themselves slightly. The 4th game was released, again, barely a year after the 3rd, and they tried to push the graphical limits of the PlayStation as best they could, which in theory should have made the Dreamcast port of the game, now titled Tomb Raider: The Last Revelation, an improvement, similar to what happened with other games like Rayman 2 and Soul Reaver. But unfortunately, the Dreamcast version of The Last Revelation was buggier and less well-liked than the PlayStation version, and Lara's controls were widely derided as being more broken and inexact than ever. All of this brings me to my experience playing Tomb Raider: The Last Revelation. I was hopeful that a new console would allow them to build a new engine, get the controls up to speed for Y2K-era gaming, but with such a breakneck pace, they were still taking bites off that same rotten apple. I did get excited, though, because after not being able to get out of the first stage for the first 3 games, thanks to those controls and a lack of clarity as to what I was supposed to be doing, The Last Revelation opens with a lengthy tutorial stage. I thought, oh hell yeah! It's actually gonna teach me how to do stuff. Maybe I'll actually be able to get into this one. Then I played the tutorial, and, well... After easily clearing the first couple tasks, this practice jump, asking me to leap across a chasm and grab onto a ledge, became my Waterloo. I have over an hour of footage of me failing to grab onto this ledge over and over and over and over. Even more frustrating, every time you fall, you have to take a very protracted route across a courtyard with water hazards, up a tiny sliver of a ramp, then navigate a rotation back up to the first plateau, using Lara's shattered f***ing tank controls to try again. It did allow me to appreciate a cute little water drip effect they added, but only because I kept falling into the f***ing pools. Trying to steer this f***ing barge of a human being was just too much. The old siren song of "Fuck Tomb Raider" surfaced repeatedly anew. I did manage to eventually, finally, navigate this ledge. Ba-ba! And then I spent about 20 minutes trying to navigate a second ledge, and then I got stuck in this water level for another 20 minutes, and that was it for me. I was moving on. If you came here hoping for an in-depth tips and tricks segment for how to navigate through the late levels or solve the tough puzzles of Tomb Raider: The Last Revelation to really get into the nitty-gritty of the game's narrative, I'm sorry to disappoint you. But you literally cannot be more disappointed than I was. To spend more than 5 combined hours on 4 games, and to not be able to navigate out of the first screen successfully in even one of them, I had to make a judgment call. We only have one life to live, and I could not spend even 1 second more allowing my time to be jeopardized by Lara Croft. This was not a series that was being created out of love or inspiration. This was a series that was being pumped out because of commerce, because the bosses at Eidos Interactive were allowed to demand so much of the good folks at Core Design. I spent many, many less hours dealing with this series than they did, but we all arrived at the same basic, fundamental point. Fuck Tomb Raider. This shit sucks. Next time, finally, an opportunity to disappear into a magical, colorful fantasy world where you can be anything your heart desires, as long as what your heart desires is to be a huge f***ing prick.